Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Frank Quinn. I'm the Director of Preservation for Heritage Ohio, and I am so glad that you have joined us this afternoon. We have a very interesting webinar today, and I'm happy to introduce Christine Thompson of Ball State. Christine is the Assistant Director and Archaeologist at the Applied Anthropology Laboratories at Ball State University. Her research interests include the Late Archaic Glacial Kame culture, public archaeology, NAGPRA. And if you know what NAGPRA stands for, then you're in the right place. If you don't, you might learn later today. And interpretation of historic battlefields. She works to fulfill the AAL mission of inspiring and preparing student employees for the workforce by providing students with hands-on learning opportunities through the fulfillment of grant awards and cultural resource management contracts. Thompson strives to build lasting partnerships with federally recognized tribes, communities, museums, historical societies, and other groups while collaborating on funded research projects. And today, Christine is going to be focusing on Frontier Ohio. At least it was the frontier for us in the 1790s, with a discussion about the history of what was happening with indigenous people who occupied Ohio and new settlers of European descent coming from the east and moving west, and how those conflicts sometimes erupted into violence, the stories that have been told over the years, and how archaeology and historical archaeology can help to provide a more fuller picture of what happened during these events. So with that, I'm excited. I'm going to sit back and listen to Chris, and I will turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Frank. Yeah, that all made me sound kind of fancy, which I'm not. So I've been at Ball State about 15 years. I went back there to get my master's. So I was mentioning to Frank before we started, this is actually a second career for me. So I spent 25 years in the business world helping manufacturing companies and educational institutions install software. So I started out as a programmer. So I'm one of the few archaeologists that I know of that have an MBA, that have a business degree and an anthropology degree. And it's actually been quite handy. And I really appreciate the opportunity to speak today. I have lots of interesting things to share, and we'll just get right to it here. So we're going to focus on the Northwest Indian War battle, St. Clair's defeat, which took place in 1791 and involved an alliance of 9 tribes in the United States military. So we started our archaeology research back in 2010, and that's really evolved into what is today a co-created native interpretation of St. Clair's defeat, which actually you guys can go see until January 7th at the Fort Recovery Museum. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. And we're going to share that interpretive product and another one that we did as part of this research. That's kind of the focus of my talk, but we'll cover a lot of other things as well. And so our first topic will be St. Clair's defeat. And I do want to point out like 2 things that kind of permeate my work and important to understand is, one is the site of St. Clair's defeat is in Fort Recovery, Ohio, which is Mercer County. So it's clear on the west side of the state on the Indiana border, kind of halfway up the state, in the middle of the state, but on the far western border. And Fort Recovery itself is like a mile from the Indiana state line. That actually is my hometown. So that is a very interesting place for me to be, that I'm doing research in my hometown. I don't live there anymore, but my mom does, and it's a small town, so I pretty much know everybody there. So that's something I always want to point out. And then the actual 11 acres of the battlefield site is it's an Ohio History Connection site, and it has a museum, and the museum is managed by the Fort Recovery Historical Society. So when we do this research, we actually collaborate with the Ohio History Connection site. We collaborate with the Fort Recovery Historical Society. We collaborate with descendant tribes, so up to 39 descendant tribes of the 9 tribes that participated in St. Clair's defeat. And so it's a huge, in the community. So it's a huge set of stakeholders that we work with. So I like to point that out at the beginning. All right, so we're going to give a little short history lesson of St. Clair's defeat, and then we're going to talk about the archaeology, and then we're going to talk about these interpretation products that I've alluded to. And I'm going to kind of check my notes periodically to make sure I'm covering things. All right, so here's the timeline, so the period of time that we're talking about. So from the Treaty of Paris that basically ended the Revolutionary War to Ohio statehood was 20 years. And kind of in the middle of that was Arthur St. Clair's campaign, which pretty much ended on November 4th, 1791, as part of St. Clair's defeat, or in St. Clair's defeat. And so both Harmer in 1790 and St. Clair in 1791, they were charged by President Washington to basically attack Kikianga, which is now Fort Wayne. So if you look on this map, the bottom map, the red dot on that map is where Fort Recovery is. And the blue, the north blue dot in Indiana, that was Kikianga, which is now Fort Wayne. And then the south blue dot is Cincinnati, which at that time was Fort Washington. So in 1791, St. Clair was charged with building a series of forts from Fort Washington up into Indian homelands and to capture Kikianga, which is now Fort Wayne. So he started late in the season. I think he started in August. And the last fort they built was Fort Jefferson, which is by Greenville, Ohio. And that's about 30 miles, give or take, south of where Fort Recovery is now. And so from Fort Jefferson, after they built Fort Jefferson in October, St. Clair's army of 1,400 men marched up towards Kikianga and took 6 or 7 days. And on the night of November 3rd, they camped on the banks of the Wabash River, which is where Fort Recovery is right now. And so St. Clair had 1,400 soldiers and camp followers. So he had 250 women and children with him, give or take. And it's fascinating to read the journals. One officer brought his 10-year-old son with him. So it's kind of amazing, I guess, how they looked at that campaign and what they thought the outcome was going to be. And then at the same time, this 9-tribe alliance, led by the Miami, Delaware, and Shawnee, who lived in Kikianga, they gathered these 9 tribes together, and they congregated in Kikianga. They had sent scouts out. They knew St. Clair was traveling north, so the scouts were kind of following, keeping an eye on him. So while St. Clair was traveling north from Fort Jefferson, the Native American Alliance was traveling south from Kikianga, and they met on the banks of the Wabash River on the evening of November 3rd. The actual battle is November 4th. So this was the worst defeat ever of the U.S. Army at the hands of the American Indians. So the U.S. Army was totally annihilated, totally devastated. Over really, that should read, over 650 soldiers plus nearly all the camp followers were killed, another 250 plus wounded. And most accounts say less than 50 Native Americans killed. Some say as low as 20 to 30. And so it was just a total rout. Oops. So this kind of shows the battlefield. And the blue rectangle is where St. Clair set up his main encampment on the late afternoon of November 3rd. So the blue is kind of all his troops. The kind of yellowish rectangle in the middle would be where the civilians and where the fires were. The little blue dots surrounding the big rectangle are St. Clair's outposts. And then they kind of camped in this triangle of land where the Wabash River and what's called Buck Ditch kind of came together. So you can kind of see how they're on that land. And that was kind of the first little piece of high land east of the river. In the meantime, the Wyandot, Seneca, Cherokee, Miami, Shawnee, and Delaware, and the Ottawa, Ojibwa, and Potawatomi, they had come from Kikianga in groups of 20 or 25, like almost like hunting parties. And then they assembled on a high ridge the night of November 3rd when they saw where St. Clair had camped. So, and they assembled in a huge crescent formation. And this crescent formation was a tactic they had used before at previous battles, but never in a battle this large with this many tribes. The tribal alliance also numbered around 1,400 men. And I had somebody ask me the other day how big the crescent was. And if you take, 1,400 and you take shoulder to shoulder and give everybody, I don't know, 2 or 3 feet, the crescent would have been almost 3/4 of a mile or a mile long. And the high ridge they assembled on, we have done metal detector out there and found some artifacts and evidence that supports that is probably the high ridge that they were on. And all this is based on also primary resources, military journals, and white captive descriptions as well. So the battle actually begun at dawn on November 4th, and the strategy was the Miami, Shawnee, and Delaware. They attacked the Kentucky militia, and I failed to mention the Kentucky militia is that little blue hash mark east of the river that numbered about 300 men. And the reason the Kentucky militia were across the river by themselves was because St. Clair felt like he didn't have enough room on that little piece of high ground with his main encampment. So they decided to go across the river. So the Miami, Shawnee, and Delaware attacked the Kentucky militia, totally surprised them like at 6 a.m., 6:30 a.m. in the morning. The Kentucky militia turned around and ran back into St. Clair's main camp. So went back across the river into the main camp, caused total chaos. And at the same time, the 3 tribes on the right of the crescent and the 3 tribes on the left of the crescent completely surrounded St. Clair's army in 15 minutes. Again, those are from primary resources. The entire battle lasted 3 hours. And those that survived the battle from a U.S. military perspective, they retreated. So they did a big flanking maneuver, and they retreated and basically ran down the same route that they came up from Fort Jefferson. So they that was their escape route, is that almost 30 miles back to Fort Jefferson. So one of the fascinating things that I've learned about in my research is that like really hadn't dawned on me until a couple years ago, is not only was it a almost total devastation of life, is the loss to the military of equipment and gear. So in one of the diaries, I think it's Winthrop Sargent's, but I might be incorrect. It lists all the equipment they lost. So, and in one of the sentences, it's something about, we left every last thing behind. So they ran for their lives. So they list how many tents they lost and what kind they were. They list all the guns they lost. They list the cannons. They list the wagons, the horses, and then they put a dollar value on them, which is really interesting because you can, and then they have a total, we lost this much value. So, you can equate it to today's dollars, and I have that somewhere. I talk about it a lot. I should have it right in front of me. So it's very interesting, to think about what that battlefield looked like, immediately after. And so St. Clair was obviously, he survived the battle. He was relieved of his command of the army at that time. He was also the governor of the Northwest Territory. And they handed over the reins of the military to Anthony Wayne. He accepted under one condition, that he would have time to properly train his troops and to basically regroup. And he did that from 1792 to 1793, at which time he built some other forts, including fort at Greenville, and also including a fort at Fort Recovery. So on Christmas Day, 1793, he actually wrote a letter to Henry Burbeck, who was his main fort architect, I guess you'd call him. They were both at Greenville, but Greenville was big. So he wrote a letter to Burbeck, and he said, tomorrow morning at Reveille, you are to march to St. Clair's, the site of St. Clair's defeat, and build a fort, and you are to call it Fort Recovery. And so they built the fort on Fort Recovery on Christmas Day, 1793, and finished it up in the spring. And then on June 30th, there was an actual attack with probably more tribes and more troops. It was a 2-day battle, and they actually the Native Americans attacked a supply train that was heading back to the fort at Greenville, because Fort Recovery was like a supply fort, and so they were constantly going back and forth delivering supplies. And so the Native Americans were trying to disrupt the supply chain, which was a clever thing to do. That battle, the Battle of Fort Recovery on June 30th, 1794, is considered a U.S. victory. The tribes did not agree on the strategy on that one. Some tribes wanted to attack the fort and others didn't. And then the Battle of Fallen Timbers was 6 weeks later. So that's kind of the time frame. And these battles, Fallen Timbers, the Battle of Fort Recovery, effectively ended the Indian resistance in the Northwest Territories and led to the Treaty of Greenville, which was the next summer, 1795. So here we show the Greenville Treaty Line. So as a treaty, the Greenville Treaty Line comes across Ohio, and then makes a little jog around Fort Laramie, and then it comes up to that point there on the far western side, and then goes south. That point is actually a stake that's at Fort Recovery. So when Israel Ludlow put in, I guess, cited in the Greenville Treaty Line, it sounds like by his notes he used the fort as like a marker, and then the actual Greenville Treaty Line marker they found in the 30s, I think, and there's a little plaque there at Fort Recovery, and so that's where it turns south and goes down to the Ohio River. Oops. And then I always like showing this map. So this map is on or around 1803, around that general area. So when Ohio became a state, so that basically ended the Northwest Territory. At that time, Ohio was a mix of towns and Indian villages. Especially school kids, I always tell, and adults too, I always, say, think about in 1795, we had the Treaty of Greenville, and Ohio became a state in 1803. So, that treaty didn't really last too long as far as, what it was meant to do. The fort at Fort Recovery was most likely destroyed around 1814, and then Fort Recovery, the town, started being settled shortly after that. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about our archaeological research and preservation research. So we funded most of our archaeological research with the bulk of it with National Park Service American Battlefield Protection Program grants. Those grants really emphasize landscape analysis. So both in the context of recovered artifacts and then the role that the landscape played. And they emphasize understanding the landscape in the context of both sides. So both, in this case, both the U.S. military and the American Indian Alliance. And so they actually use something called COCOA, which is an acronym for all the landscape features that you would analyze. So you would look at landscape features as what was an obstacle in the battle, what provided cover and concealment, what provided, where was your field of fire. So interestingly, the military still uses that today. And when they would train us in that, one year we actually had somebody who had just been in, forget, like Iraq or Iran, and he actually used this in his, when he was out fighting or in the military. And so that was fascinating to hear him train us in that technique. So what that results in is that really results in a more nuanced interpretation of the battles. So it recognizes both sides. It recognizes the role the landscape played. It takes the emphasis off of artifacts are important, don't get me wrong, but it takes the emphasis off of just finding things, and it puts the emphasis on, what do these things mean based on where we found them. And so that's kind of the basis of our work. And we also had several other grant agencies that funded this work. The Ohio History Fund funded part of it. Ohio Humanities, mentioned the National Park Service. Part of our interpretation, you'll see, has been funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. So this is almost 15 years of work that's been funded by lots and lots of different grants. Sometimes I introduce myself as, hi, I'm Chris, I write grants for a living, because that's kind of what it feels like. So one of the things we did in our archaeological research is we wanted to do metal detector survey and also some excavation, but we wanted that to be really targeted. And we wanted to really concentrate on where we thought the area was where the American Indians staged their crescent formation. And so the yellow is kind of the core battlefield boundary. So the yellow would encompass where St. Clair's encampment was and where kind of the main fighting happened. The blue and then the green are our two expanded areas, and that's where we thought would be our best bet of finding where the high ridge probably was and exploring more of the crescent formation. And so we asked landowners, some of them who I still knew, we asked them if we could survey, and some said yes, and some said no, and that's okay. And so we did quite a bit of metal detecting survey in the blue and the green areas where we had permission. So these are just a couple of examples of our work. And we found some battle era artifacts. So we found some lead balls. We found some buckles. We found some lead ingots. We found a piece off a Charleville musket. So we found some interesting things, but what was more interesting is where we found them. So based on where we found them, we started to hone in on where we thought the high ridge was, based on the landscape. And then we started doing things in GIS. So I'm not a GIS whiz, but I have a colleague, Kevin Nolan, who is. And so one of the things we did is, okay, if where we think the high ridge is, could the American Indians have surrounded St. Clair's army in 15 minutes without being detected based on the landscape? And this kind of shows that. So this kind of shows the path they could have taken to kind of stay undetected to St. Clair's army and do this surrounding technique. So that's one thing that we kind of played around with to see if we could support the primary sources. And then we also did visibility studies. So we wanted to look at and think about this idea of what St. Clair could see and not see, and what the American Indians could see and not see. So where St. Clair was camped, he was on a little bit of high ground, and the red represents the crescent, and the red is mostly shaded in black. He could not see basically this 1,400 man Native army that was just behind this high ridge because of the way the landscape is and topography. And I don't think I put in this other slide, but if you reverse it, when you're out on that high ridge, and I've been out there before, when you're out on that high ridge, when you look down, it's almost like a spotlight is on where St. Clair's encampment would have been, because the land is a little bit higher up there, and then it goes down to where the river is, and then it comes up a little bit, and that's where he decided to camp. So he was almost as visible as he could have been in the spot he chose, and yet he couldn't see what was happening to the northwest. They did have scouts, but not all the scouting information got back to him. So he had no idea that this 1,400 tribal army was assembling the night before. So we took all of this information, and we wanted to do updated interpretation. And the main reason why is that, like many American Indian sites in Ohio and Indiana, in removal states, they're almost always interpreted from a Euro-American view. So I grew up in Fort McCaffrey, and if somebody would have asked me where the battle took place, I would have said uptown, because that's where St. Clair's army was camped, and that's really all you thought about. You thought about that's where they camped, and that's where the battle took place. So we really started doing a lot of public outreach with maps, especially. So we found that people really were drawn to the maps and drawn to this idea of, the Native Americans, assembled on the ridge, and they and that the battlefield was big. So one of our taglines became, "The battlefield is bigger than you think," which is kind of corny, but it worked, and it got people to think about it and look at things, and it started discussions. And one of the things that's talked about in the preservation world is, people are more apt to preserve things that they understand. We never, in Fort McCaffrey, we never called we never called it the battlefield. We're starting to now more. And so, people kind of understand more how important this land and all 750 acres is, because of some of the maps and some of the primary resources we've showed and shared. So we did a lot of public outreach. We also did, we called it a book of maps. It basically told the stories of the two battles, again, through maps and kind of short little vignettes, to get people to understand that the battle just wasn't, on 2 blocks of the uptown area, that it was a big, large area, and it had, this awesome strategy by the American Indians. So one of the things that was always focused on at this site is the reasons why St. Clair lost, which there was many. So he had bad supplies, and he had ill-trained troops, and he started too late, and the weather was bad, and all that's true. But we wanted to get emphasis on this strategy that the American Indians use, this crescent strategy, and how they surrounded St. Clair's and how they attacked the Kentucky militia first. And we wanted to make sure people understood that too. So that was kind of our effort there. We also received several grants to design and then manufacture 15 wayside exhibits. So these 15 wayside exhibits actually kind of meander through the battlefield, and the total loop is 1.5 miles long. And we were that existing trail that you see winding through there was already there. So we didn't have to make the trail, but we used kind of existing infrastructure to put these signs throughout basically the village, where people could see different aspects of the battle and different, points of interest. And one of the wayside exhibits shows some of the maps that I've shown before. So some of our research is featured on that. And then with additional funding, we created a story map, which is like a battlefield tour. So it's online, and you can find it at the Historical Society Museum website. And so you can walk the wayside exhibits and then use your phone to follow along. And you can do that from your PC at home as well. So those were things that we did. Oh, and these are screenshots of the online tour, the story map, and then it also has 15 stops, so it coincides with those exhibits. And again, all this is to build awareness of the American Indian strategy and the Crescent Formation and where all that happened. And there's another kind of view of that. All of these things we did with tribal support. So all of our archaeological research and all of these initial kind of public outreach components we did with tribal support, but there wasn't, and sometimes tribal review, but there wasn't, certainly wasn't co-created with tribes at that point. So, you know, they would write support letters for the grants, but we didn't have meetings with them necessarily about exactly the content. I mean, they knew we were doing these things. And here's a couple other screenshots from that phone app you can use, a battlefield tour. And so, like I just said, this research was done with tribal support letters for grants, sometimes tribal review, but we weren't really satisfied. We weren't doing bad work, but we weren't doing work that really told the story with true tribal collaboration or co-creation. So we kind of had a turning point in 2017. Is we were invited to a community engaged scholarship in Indian country kind of symposium in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And we felt kind of, my colleague and I felt kind of over our heads. So it was lots of tribal participants. It was researchers who worked closely and collaborative with tribes. And we realized that we wanted to do better. That was really helpful to us to be invited to that symposium so we could see how much work we had to do. That's what it felt like. And so we realized that we had two communities to engage. So we were pretty good at engaging the community of Fort Recovery. We could get people to agree to let us survey. We had good support from the organizations. You know, the community of Fort Recovery knew the Euro-American perspective of the battle, and they took great pride in the history and interest in our research. We realized that we had to do a better job of collaborating and working with tribal nations. That was a little harder because that was dispersed. Most of the people we work with are in Oklahoma and some in other states. There's multiple tribal histories of the battle. So, you know, there's not just one Native American history of St. Clair's defeat. There's, you know, in that case, 9 stories to consider. And there was also great pride in their history and interest in our research. So one of the things that we kind of bought into and really used to support our work going forward was this idea of community engaged research and scholarship. And the whole idea of that is that when you're working with a community, whether it's a local community or a tribal community, is that the research should be mutually beneficial. So you should work with a community and not just about a community. So if we're doing research on St. Clair's defeat and we're talking about American Indian strategy, then we need to work really, really closely with those tribes. And so, and this is just kind of a visual that the level of engaged scholarship in the community of Fort McCaffrey at the time, we were working with the community pretty well. We thought, okay, we kind of know how to do that. But that's when we realized that with tribal nations, we were really just doing research for a community, and we weren't working with them near as well as we wanted to. And at this time, tribes had seen our research and they wanted to collaborate and co-create. And so we took advantage of that. And so one of the things that most interested them was the whole crescent formation. And so we also were asked to share our research at the Ohio Tribal Nations Conference that the Ohio History Connection and the Ohio Department of Transportation puts together. So we took every opportunity we could to share and to tell our story and to understand what tribes would like to collaborate with us and how they would like to do that. So we would speak to anybody. And this kind of shows the visual of the 9 tribes that were in the American Indian Alliance on November 4th. Those are at least 39 federally recognized tribes today, and these are the states they're in. The vast majority of people that we work with are in Northeast Oklahoma, although we do work with people in Michigan, in Kansas, in Minnesota. And so I kind of titled this topic Lessons Learned and Tips, and then also known as Things I Wish I'd Known Better early on in this process. And these are tips that we learned as we really ramped up our tribal collaboration and our working with tribes, our tribal relationships. So one of the things I tell people is the very first thing that has to be understood is the basics of federally recognized tribes, that you're working with sovereign nations that have government to government relations with the U.S. and their special powers and responsibilities that go with that. There are 574 federally recognized tribes in Ohio. And so, or excuse me, 574 federally recognized American Indian tribes in the U.S. Around 44-ish have ties to Ohio. And this could be treaty claims. It could be that they actually lived here. It could be their removal route went through here, their hunting territory. And then one thing I tell people who say, oh, how can we, especially local historical societies or groups, how can we do better at this? You have to realize that a federally recognized tribe is not, it's not a club, it's not a group, it's a sovereign nation. So these, they're tribal citizens that are part of a sovereign nation that has special powers as bestowed upon by the U.S. government. We always also had to learn and remember that we're working with individual tribes. So we're dealing with specific tribes and not American Indians as one large group. So as much as we can, we try to refer to specific tribes in our work, in our research, in our products. Now, you can't do that every single time, but that's why on the maps, we show where the Miami, Shawnee, and Delaware were, and we show where the other tribes were. So we try to be cognizant of that and do that as much as possible. We also had to learn that each tribe will have different experiences, histories, and opinions. So when you say things like removal, well, really each tribe has a different removal story. So that was something that we really had to listen to tribal partners and understand. And we had to choose our words carefully of how we were going to present this to the public in our public products. And then we also, we invited tribes to participate. So on our latest public product, we work with 11 different tribal individuals. So I also tell people it's important to learn your geography. So what were the tribes that lived in, hunted in, traveled through, or had treaty claims in your area? Some of this information is easy to get. The first place I would start would be tribal websites, and then also the Ohio history.org website that you can start learning about what tribes would have been in your area, I guess, the longest. And then when as a local historical society or local entity, when you have a project that involves tribes, you should contact them. And the people you should contact, mostly I would start with either the tribal historic preservation officer or cultural resource officer, or if it's NAGPRA related, look for somebody that particularly that takes care of NAGPRA for that tribe. We've found by and far that personal contact is best versus mass correspondence. So one of the things we did early on is we tried to get interest in our research by doing kind of mass emails. It really worked best if we did personalized correspondence. And then if you happen to be in an Ohio History Connection site, I certainly, ask them for advice and, how they think you should make contact. Probably first and foremost, your research has to be good. So tribes expect, deserve, and rightly so, scholarly research based on best practices. And so, we happen to be a university that works closely with the Fort Recovery Historical Society. So if you're a local historical society or local museum, and you feel like, maybe you don't have the resources to do that, maybe you could partnership up with a university or, with some other research organization. And again, if you're an OHC site, I would ask them for advice. Stop talking, start listening. This work with our tribal partners has really changed how I think about these things and changed how I think about my worldview in relations to other worldviews and experiences. And so you have to give space for people to talk, and you have to give space for to process the answers that people might be giving you. And so I had to learn, I was a former business person, so I had to learn to kind of quit running tribal meetings like business meetings and run them more like relationships, and to give people plenty of time and space to talk and process. So that was a personal change that I had to make. And then these relationships take a long time. And so we were doing it for the long haul. And I also had to realize that building relationship is doing something. Visiting people, we did a lot of, when we saw one of the tribal partners that we work with, we saw them speak anywhere in Ohio and Indiana, one of us would go listen to their presentation. And so we did a lot of taking an interest in their research as we were building this over the last decade. So it has to be a mutual beneficial relationship. One thing in both meetings and in public interpretation is word choice. Words are packed with meaning, and if you're going to do true tribal collaboration, you really need tribal partners to help you with the proper words to use. So you need to have a good enough relationship that they can point out when perhaps maybe words aren't appropriate to use, or there's a better word to use. And that was something that we worked hard on our latest product. And then one of the things is we talked about that changed, I guess, for us of doing more collaborative research with tribes is that we kept showing up. So we went to conferences, we went to speakers, we went to special events. We sometimes had wonderful meetings and new ideas come out of events that we would have never thought would happen. And sometimes we think, what would have happened if we would have missed this particular event or missed speaking to this person? So we really showed up as much as we could. And so these are all kind of tenets of community engaged research, is that you're really working with and have deep connections with the community that that you're doing this research about. And this takes time, but it ends up with a better product. We also had to unlearn some things. We had to unlearn maybe how in Ohio some of us were taught about American Indians. And I love this last bullet point. Become an expert at not always being the expert. So I feel like, wow, I'm pretty good at that because I don't feel like I'm an expert at anything anymore. So those are all things to keep in mind. We had no idea in 2010 that we would end up where we are today. But you kind of have to be prepared and plan and develop good relationships, and good things will happen as far as like tribal collaboration in interpreting some of these American Indian sites that we have in Ohio. So we're going to talk now about kind of the culmination of our research. So in 2018, we actually received a planning grant to put together a traveling exhibit, and we titled it St. Clair's Defeat Revisited, a New View of the Conflict. And so we partnered with 11 different tribal humanities scholars who represented 8 or 9 different tribes to co-create and co-design a traveling exhibit that would tell the story of St. Clair's defeat. And we actually ended up receiving a planning grant from NEH and then an implementation grant. And so these are the tribal humanities scholars that we work with. And you can see they're from a number of different tribes. And you can see they're tribal historic preservation officers, chiefs. And so we, as part of this grant, we said, okay, we're going to have at least 3 meetings to figure out what this exhibit should be. So the very first meeting was in Oklahoma, and it was right before COVID. So whatever that would be. And they had seen our work and they had suggested doing a traveling exhibit, but we really didn't know exactly how that would look. And so we were super prepared for this first meeting. We had all the images from our wayside exhibits with us. We had multiple PowerPoints. We had this really awesome agenda. And we asked the question of these tribal humanities scholars. We said, we're probably 90 minutes into the meeting, half hour maybe. And we said, okay, who else at your tribe could we ask and talk to about St. Clair's defeat that would know more details that we could learn from? And is there anybody like that in your tribe? And they're like, no. And here's why. So for 90 minutes, they talked to us about, and they told stories about why there were not people in their tribe that knew much about St. Clair's defeat. And it was because of broken treaties. It was because of removal from their homelands. It was because of boarding schools. And all of these things that basically broke the chain of storytelling, where things like St. Clair's defeat, this great victory, would have been passed down. And so they told very personal stories about their relatives that went to boarding school and were punished for speaking their language and punished for, coming home and talking about these things. And my colleague and I were totally blown away. That I knew a little bit, about boarding schools, and I knew a little bit about tribes today. I can honestly say I never thought about talking about St. Clair's defeat in that context. So we didn't show any of our PowerPoints. We scratched our agenda. After 90 minutes, Chief Wallace of the Eastern Shawnee said, oh, I'm sorry, we've messed up your agenda in your meeting. And we're like, nope, this is what we need to talk about. So we actually came up with the 4 themes of this exhibit that day. And so the exhibit isn't just about the battle. The traveling exhibit is about the aftermath and the persistence of tribes today. And so in 2 other meetings after that, we drafted the text of this exhibit And we actually gathered the tribal humanities scholars back for each of those meetings, and we would put the draft of the exhibit on the screen, and they would wordsmith with us. So one of the things that was interesting is I would look around the room and I'd think, oh, well, I'm sure Chief Wallace and Chief Cook, have important, chiefy things to do, but they chose to be here because it's so important for them to tell the story in the proper way. And so the tribal humanities scholars approved every image. They approved the quotes. They approved and reviewed all the text. So each one of the themes that they chose became large panels. So these panels are 8 foot high by 12 to 15 foot wide. And so then this is the battle panel of this traveling exhibit. And you see some familiar things here. You see the maps. We also have a little comparison between St. Clair's defeat and the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Again, all approved by the tribal humanities scholars. We have the aftermath panel that tells kind of heartbreaking stories of individual removal stories, tribal removal stories, tells heartbreaking stories of boarding schools, kind of all in the context of, how St. Clair's defeat and battles like that started this chain of events that led to these things. And the aftermath panel is by design kind of unsettling because the events are unsettling and kind of hard to read about. And then our final theme and our final panel is persistence of tribes today. And so we had tribes submit their photos of how they wanted to show their tribal citizens today. And so the exhibit is actually up now at the museum in Fort Recovery, Ohio. And so here is what it looks like. And it's not the picket fence in the middle. It's everything around the side. So it starts with a 15-minute welcome video of all native voices, and then visitors go around and read about these things. And you can barely see it kind of behind the picket. We also have 8 cases or 8 instances of tribal artwork. And we have a little biography of the artist. So we have some beadwork, we have a lacrosse stick, some things like that to kind of show tribes and the revitalization of their culture. And so we also we have a 15-minute video that goes along with that that was funded by a National Trust for Historic Preservation grant. And then we also have online exhibit guide, which is a large story map that has all this content online. So if you can't make it to the exhibit, you can see all this. So this whole the exhibit and the video and the story map it took us 5 years and I forget 3 or 4 or 5 grants to fund all this. And then a plug to come visit us. We are still open at Fort Recovery for 4 weekends. And so the dates are there. And I'll show the screen at the end too. And so the admission's free and it's open 11 to 4 on each date to show this exhibit. And then after Fort Recovery, the exhibit travels to the Fort Wayne History Center in January to May, and then it goes out to Northwest, that should be Northeast Oklahoma. And then it goes to Ohio History Connection in 2025. We also have had numerous other venues in Oklahoma and Ohio and Indiana interested. And so we're looking at maybe making a more portable version of this to go to other venues. So we're looking at that right now. And then one of the things we found is working with tribes and forming these long-term relationships actually kind of beget other relationships. So we had a large event in August, a 2-day event at the museum where we had 5 tribal interpreters come and they did cultural events. They had some speaking presentations and we had 400 people come to this event. And the reception to that and the response to that was kind of overwhelming. We did battlefield tours, and so it was kind of a great way to build on these relationships. So it was amazing, the crowds of people that we had. So that was the main things I wanted to cover. I want to acknowledge all the funding agencies, of which the Ohio History Fund was one. They funded part of the excavation. Where we were looking for part of the original fort recovery. Lots of stakeholders involved. Our two funding agencies for the traveling exhibit are the NEH and the National Trust for Historic Preservation. My contact info, and then I wanted to, okay, we talked about the dates. I wanted to leave with the links. There's a traveling exhibit website that has all the information on it. And you know, I would invite people to come visit the exhibit if you'd like a little drive to the west end of Ohio. So yeah, whatever, if we have time for questions or comments.
We have a few minutes. I believe we have started receiving some questions. If you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat box. If you need to head off for something else, I just want to remind everyone that Heritage Ohio has a YouTube channel. So if you go to YouTube and search Heritage Ohio, you can find all of our webinars there. This one will be available, so if you miss the Q&A portion or want to go back and listen to it, you can go to our YouTube site. So, and I think, did I see, Devin, did we have one question?
Yeah, there's one question from L. Do you want me to read it?
Sure.
All right. Christine, the question is, do you have any data or information about the economic impact in the local community of your research, such as increased number of tourists and visitors, etc.? And then there's a couple more parts to this, but you can answer that part first.
Well, yes, some. So I know, like, there's a special event we had in August. We had 400 people there. I know for a fact, like, some stayed overnight. And some were, we had 13 states, people from 13 states. So obviously there was an economic impact there. I can't, you know, put like a monetary number on it. So far to the exhibit in Fort Recovery, the traveling exhibit, so St. Clair's Defeat Revisited, has been there since November 4th, open 3 days a week. And we've had 781 visitors. And we have some more school groups coming, and I know some other people. So my guess is we're going to hit probably close to 1,200. You know, almost not a visit goes by when people don't ask about, you know, like any place. Oh, where can I go to eat? Where can I do this? And those visitors have been from 10 states so far. And the interesting thing is, you know, Fort Recovery isn't close to anything. You know, we're an hour away from Dayton and an hour away from Lima. You know, so people have to, you just don't stumble upon this by accident. You know, we're 45 minutes from I-75. So you're not seeing a sign on the highway and stopping by. So yeah, people, I'm sure it does.
Yeah, I had one.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, I think somebody just unmuted for this moment.
Oh, okay. So I'm sure, you know, it does drive a local economy. And that's one of the big reasons there's such support from the community, because they know whatever happens with any group or any event in Fort Recovery, if it brings people to the community, then they're happy to support it.
Thanks, Christine. So the rest of Elle's question here is, do you work with the local travel and tourism bureaus for the project? And then kind of an adjoining question is, what do you plan to do with the project after the traveling exhibit winds down?
We didn't, I mean, we certainly, I know the local tourism bureau was aware of it. But I personally didn't work closely with them. I did a lot of advertising with the museum director. and we did, radio spots and newspaper articles and Facebook and that kind of thing. And I think I covered where it's going to display after the grant funded run in 2025. We're exploring right now of how does this exhibit live after that time. So we're doing that both of how can we take the existing traveling exhibit to other venues after 2025, and then we're looking at making a more portable version to take to more. Because with 10 people already interested, this is going to stretch out a number of years. So we're trying to get multiple versions of it so we can get it more places quicker.
Thanks, Christine. Another question was, can you repeat your email for the audience?
Yep, and I'll put it in the chat. So it's ckkeller2@bsu.edu. So if any of you are out there and say, hey, we'd be interested in having this exhibit, shoot me an email, because we're keeping a list. And we are actually working on some grant applications in the next couple of months to get more portable versions available to museums.
All right, Frank, that looks like it was the last question we had. Do you have anything else?
Well, for the geographically challenged, or maybe folks who don't know exactly where Ball State is, you are not too far from the border of Ohio, correct?
Yeah, so Ball State is an hour southwest of Fort Recovery. So it would be, it's in Muncie, Indiana. So Muncie is like south of Fort Wayne, southwest of Fort Wayne.
And I was curious. So among one of the many things that I didn't realize was that Cherokee was one of the 9 tribes involved in the battle. And I had always, my understanding, I guess, was that that was more of a southern tribe. And so I was kind of interested, was there an active Cherokee population that lived in Ohio, or were they called upon as part of this confederation, or how did that happen?
Yeah, and you're asking me a question I can't answer right off the top of my head, but there wasn't very, and I wish I had the book in front of me that told how many of each tribe. There wasn't very many Cherokee fighters. I forget how many, but it wasn't very many, and I forget the exact reason. Yeah, they were in the area, so I don't know the answer to that. We do not have any Cherokee representation as part of our tribal humanities scholars. Yeah, I don't have a perfect answer to that, but they were involved, but it wasn't in as great a numbers as like the Miami, Shawnee, and Delaware.
Okay. And was there, I'm sorry if I missed this, was there a lead tribe that was coordinating among the various groups?
Yeah, a lead tribe, is that what you?
Mm-hmm.
Most people would say that the Miami, Shawnee, and Delaware kind of actually led with Blue Jacket and Little Turtle, but in Bacongahelas. So I mean, that's usually, and they were in the middle of the crescent. The Miami with William Wells was actually in charge of picking off the cannons, so they had an important job. So they killed the cannoneers, I guess you call them, and then they spiked the cannons so they couldn't be used. So yes, but those 3 tribes would be kind of the main tribes.
Right. I don't see any other questions. Again, plug for the Ohio History Fund, which offers modest grants, but grants that can help to make something happen either in the history field, archaeology field, historic preservation. I should have prepared a little bit better. I'm not sure what their grant cycle is, but they do have an annual grant cycle for Ohio History Fund. So it's if you have a project or ideas for a project, it's well worth your time and effort to get in touch with Ohio History Connection. and see if there's a potential for a fit there.
Usually
Tax
they're,
time's coming up.
what's that?
I said tax time's coming up, so you can contribute on your tax returns.
Yeah.
Very true.
Usually their cycle is September. And kind of to build on that, there's no way we could have gotten one grant to do all this because we wouldn't have known enough to do it all in one big piece anyhow. So yeah, I highly recommend that, you go after grant funding kind of piecemeal to fund different pieces of a large research project. Then it's manageable and it doesn't feel so big.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Richard Burry has a hand up. It looks like you're muted. We can go ahead and.
Okay, I have a question. Do you know anything about Braddock and his defeat at all?
I know that the Native Americans used this crescent formation at that battle, because I've looked at that from that aspect. But for the details, I'd have to go back and refresh my memory. But I know that's in one of our reports, we talked about how a similar strategy was used there. But I was thinking it was less, I don't want to say a smaller battle, but I was thinking there was less number of tribes or tribal fighters involved. But I'm not for sure on that.
Because that's always been listed as, along with this battle, the two that really kind of tripped up George Washington and said, whoop, we need to do something here.
And I think that's the one where he knew the strategy had been used before and he talked about it. He kind of warned St. Clair. So if I have the correct battle.
And Braddock's defeat, was that Western Pennsylvania?
Yes.
Right. Thanks for the question, Richard. Great. Well, Christine, this has been very interesting, and I appreciate you joining us. And hopefully folks can either get over to Fort Recovery or go online and see, get a better understanding of how these events fell into place and what happened. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. And as Heritage Ohio, we're a nonprofit organization that does webinars on a regular basis. So pay attention to our website, heritageohio.org, our e-blasts that go out on a regular basis to find out about the next webinar or other events that we may be hosting. So with that, I wish everyone a great rest of your day and hope to see you soon.
Thank you very much.